Welcome back, listeners, to a new episode of The Scorekeepers. I'm your host, Daniel Farrell, and on this episode, I'd like to welcome Andrew A. Hill. Andrew is a versatile conductor and professional musician based in New York City. With a background in trombone performance and a master's of music in conducting, Andrew has performed at esteemed venues worldwide, including Carnegie Hall and Berliner Philharmonie. From making his New York City debut with the New Conductors Orchestra to his role as band director at Byram Hills High School, Andrew's musical journey is both dynamic and inspiring. I'm super excited to chat with him about his upcoming work and performances. Welcome to The Scorekeepers. Welcome, Andrew. Excited to have you here.
Yes, thank you so much, Daniel.
So you are conducting the Broadway Bach Ensemble in October in New York. Can you tell our audience a little about the ensemble?
Yes, so I actually will be filling in as the assistant conductor for the majority of the 2023-2024 season. And my colleague and friend Audrey Edelstein is having a baby, and she serves as the primary assistant conductor for the orchestra. And this orchestra rehearses and performs on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Primarily is filled with community members. They do 3 concerts a season and a variety of repertoire with great soloists from the New York Philharmonic, as well as many other professionals around the country and world. For the October concert coming up, we'll have 3 pieces of literature on the docket. The first one will be the Overture to the Flying Dutchman. Second piece is Franz Liszt's Paraphrase on a Dies Irae, and then finishing out with Symphonie Fantastique, which is a piece that I near and dear to my heart.
They're all very different pieces, all romantic, but very different. Can you give us a little bit of an overview of the work?
Yeah, I'll go in reverse order. The Symphonie Fantastique, composed by Hector Berlioz in 1830. And this piece was pretty monumental in the Romantic era, kind of the battle against, pure romanticism versus the notion of programmatic works. And Berlioz, in this very autobiographical piece, was really pushing the envelope of his desire to kind of make a really dramatic programmatic work with his really kind of personal relationship with this woman, Harriet. And the work transcends a lot of really great things where there's introduction of a lot of brass and percussion, as well as lots of extended techniques for woodwinds, especially for, featuring the E-flat clarinet in the 5th movement. So the piece takes place over 5 movements, really having a different journey of his love lust after his woman, Harriet. But unfortunately, at the time when he wrote this, he was not dating her, wasn't seeking her out. And then it was kind of a creepy realization when he wanted her to come to the premiere, and she realized that, oh, this piece is about me. This is sort of a really dramatic love poem in a kind of cryptic way. And so the piece takes place, the first movement, the Passions, talks about all of the different amazing passion that he feels for Harriet. And then in that movement, we really have a domination of the theme, the idée fixe, which is the fixed idea that represents her as an entity. And it's presented in a really beautiful, elegant way in the first movement. And then in the second movement, we go to the ball where he's dancing and enjoying himself and trying to seek her love across the room. And that opens up in the middle of the piece where he sort of sees her from afar. From there, the third movement, we have them in sort of a pasture, and it's a little bit more solemn, and it's almost like a dream state of what he wants to be living with her in this pasture and having his love affair with Harriet. But then as he goes to the fourth movement, we have the march to the scaffold, where he's been really induced with an over crazy opium trip. And then from there, he finds himself being marched to the scaffold after murdering his lover and then being executed there. And there's a lot of really dramatic text painting with the music representing many aspects of that in the fifth movement. After he's been executed, his opium dream continues, where he becomes really in this cryptic forest scene where the witches and demons and devils and then also his lover Harriet are dancing in celebration of his death. And that's really when we see the Idée Fixe become its most twisted and cryptic, and the E flat clarinet really does that really well. In addition to the full orchestra, and then it's just a marvelous work.
Yeah, it's a magnificent piece, and it's so I hate using the word epic, but it was so epic at the time because it's so large scale, and
Yep.
having this narrative, like you mentioned, was unheard of at the time. So, how does that? Because that is just an absolutely huge work. How does that compare to more of the Wagner and the Liszt, which are much smaller in scale?
Yeah. So I think too, for when I dive into literature like this, I feel like I have to live with the works that are maybe a little longer and a little bit more deep in that way. Obviously, I think too, thinking about the Wagner Flying Dutchman within the context of the greater opera informs a lot of how you approach studying that piece, how you approach interpretation, how you think about what would the pacing of this be if we were scaling the entire thing. And I think too, there's sort of an interesting correlation too between the Liszt and the Berlioz, where you have the Gregorian
Hmm.
chant melody Dies Irae within the Franz Liszt, and then that's also featured in the fifth
Right.
movement of the Berlioz. So with our conductor Michael Tietz, I think it's really brilliant that he was able to put that together.
So for the Litz work in particular, you're working with a solo pianist with the orchestra. How
Yes.
does your role as a conductor change when you're dealing with a soloist?
Yeah. So I think for the conductor, as you prepare the orchestra, you really want to have them be sort of on guard for any situation that would come up for them. Because you can rehearse the orchestra and maybe you have a concept of how something goes in your head. And if you're too fixated on that, then your preparation with the orchestra is going to be pretty narrow, versus if you were going to give them a lot of variety. As I'm going into this process, I'm going to be observing most of the rehearsals with scores and thinking about how I might be interpreting it, but really serving the lead conductor. But I think for me, when I've done concertos in the past, like Rhapsody in Blue, I've conducted before, and for things like that, it's preparing the orchestra and rehearsing them in a way where you never quite do
Hmm.
things the same way. Maybe also have a range of tempos that you're working with them on. So the orchestra has a malleability to it that really allows them to showcase not only their best accompaniment as well as their best melodic material, but then in addition gives them the flexibility and malleability when the soloist arrives to make that soloist stand out and be really supported and sound the best they possibly can. Because then once the soloist gets in, you really are trying to listen to them, hear the nuance of how they want to finish a cadence, especially, and then really emulate that clearly through your gesture to the orchestra so that they respond in a really meaningful, a really collaborative way. And you're really you're sort of like a vehicle between the soloist and the orchestra, helping guide both.
How does it work, when you're in that moment on stage conducting with a soloist and you're working with them? Do you feel like you're leading? Are you taking cues from them? Are they leading? Is it more of like passing it sort of back and forth? Like how do you deal with that?
I think it's always a give and take, even if you took a soloist out of a concerto setting, because in an orchestral setting, you're going to have moments where the instrumentalists in the orchestra are
Mhm.
going to have solos, and that same principle is going to apply. And so with a concerto, it's just magnified in front of you, where that that person is going to have a more prominent role throughout the duration of the piece of music. But sometimes you're leading the orchestra and really helping drive a moment in the piece. Sometimes the soloist is really driving the piece and you're following the soloist, and then again translating that as clearly as you possibly can. And the big goal, I think, with a solo piece of music and an orchestra is to get out of the way as much as possible, and not, again, don't overconduct, because you want everything to be really Loctite, really clear, and allowing the soloist to shine through. So then if the soloist has a really important part, but maybe the orchestration is a little dense, you're going to have to show that in your gesture, but also maybe help the orchestra. Like, hey, this says mezzo forte here, but we cannot play that here. We have to play more mezzo piano or piano for the soloist to shine through. So dynamics become really subjective
Mm.
and really flexible based on the context of the work.
What does preparation or practice look like for you as a conductor? Maybe specifically for the Broadway Bach, but just in general, like how do you practice? How do you get prepared with the work?
So for me, I have a pretty great score study process that I learned in grad school. And so the first thing I do is I probably will get about 3 to 4 different recordings. And I usually just listen to them one time through each, just to hear different interpretations. And then from there, will try as much as possible to not pick like one recording that I love, because if I do that, then I start to gravitate towards, oh,
Mm,
that's, this person's interpretation. And maybe from there, I'm matching that person's interpretation too much, rather than investigating the music and really seeing what it's like from there. So, and then from there, my first step is going through and looking at instrumentation and really knowing exactly who's playing when and what movements, especially for a rehearsal plan, it's very helpful, because you
mm,
might not have everybody playing on every piece, and you want to be mindful of that as you go into rehearsing, and not spending an hour in the middle of your rehearsal on a concerto that we have
right.
like a bunch of brass tacit or percussion tacit. And then from there I go to form, and really just feeling out how the form of the piece works and getting a general sense of that for pacing, climaxes, major transitions, tempos, trying to get making sure we know all the tempo markings. From there, I really try to dive into understanding the harmony and also my melodic analysis. So I do like melody, counter melody, accompaniment, thinking about, again, that dynamic shading of, not all dynamics are created equal. And when you have fortes across every stave of the orchestral score, from there, after I do melodic analysis, harmonic analysis, then I try to do phrasal analysis, really figuring out where the start and stops of all the phrases are, and thinking about how transitions throughout those micro phrases are going to happen. From there, going in the cueing, and then finally going into special effects, knowing like when your mutes are coming on and off, harmonics, knowing what those sounding pitches are, different bow strokes that you might have in the strings. And so then from there, so that's sort of like the process of, and it's funny because it's practicing, but it's really just a lot of score study. From there, as you go through those various steps many, many different times, and you look through the score, hundreds of times at this point probably, is then your brain and your body start to absorb, okay, now what does that look like in a physical way? How do I communicate this moment gesturally? And so a little bit of that does happen, practicing waving your arms, or practice conducting in front of a mirror. But really a lot of it is, the more I score study, the more my brain and my body understands the music. And then through lots of experience and practice, you've got a lot of tools at your toolbox to be able to do that. But it's really, in my opinion, pretty difficult to conduct really well without knowing the score really well. Really, then once you're on the podium, your ears have to be really open to digest, okay, well, what am I hearing? What are things that are going well? What are things that I'm not liking from the orchestra? But here, what are things that we're going to do to fix these various different challenges as we get a chance to hear them?
Yeah, you touched on it a little bit, and with your preparation and going into the rehearsal, and your ears, listening constructively for what the orchestra is giving you. And I think a lot of people think like, they go to a concert and they're like, oh, the conductor's on stage in a performance, like wave their hands around, and that's about it. But there's so much work like behind the scenes, leading up to a concert, through the rehearsal and preparing the group. How do you approach a rehearsal versus a concert? Are you in a different place mentally for each of those, or are you in the same place?
Yeah, that's a great question. And sometimes if I had an ideal world where everything was peachy keen and we had rainbows and butterflies, I would say, most rehearsals should feel as close to a performance as possible. And I give this sort of statement generically to sometimes ensembles, is that we want to practice like we're going to perform. So I think of it a lot about, when I get to the rehearsal, how am I setting the tone for the orchestra? Because, if I go in there and I play 4 bars and then I cut the group off and I give them a laundry list of things to do, well, already they're not going to be happy. And so then the rest of the rehearsal is going to, be a reflection of that first moment. Depending on the orchestra you're working with, they, may have not, practiced the last few days, or, or the orchestra as a whole hasn't rehearsed for a week. And so you want to sort of get the ball rolling, get everybody comfortable, get everybody playing and in the mix of the music. So then when you do stop and you say, hey, violins, this part was really great, thank you so much for practicing, or sounded beautiful, we're going to work on this other section that I think we could use a little help on. Here's some things that I want. 1, 2, ready, go. So then you're thinking about your rehearsal pacing as kind of macro, micro, macro. Okay, at a first rehearsal, we're going to try to just read everything. And then as we go into the subsequent rehearsals, we're really going to have targeted goals. But I really still like to try and have the orchestra play as much as possible at the beginning of the rehearsal. Obviously, if something is crashing and burning, you got to stop and restart. But I think it's important that the musicians are there to play. Now, for me too, as a conductor, I try to give my best gesturing, my best cueing, my best expressivity in every rehearsal so that when we do a concert, it's not like, oh, Mr. Vanilla up there conducted us really boring for 6 weeks and then now he looks like he's Leonard Bernstein up there.
Right. There should never be a surprise.
Yeah. So I think for my goal personally, is I always really try to give them my best. Now, granted, sometimes you're in like thinking mode, and then when I get into thinking mode, sometimes I get a little stale, and so that's the balance. And so then when you get to the performance, right, you have to kind of you have to listen, you have to be really in the moment and be ready for anything. Again, adjusting as the orchestra is going through there, but I think that's when you can sort of take your guard down a little bit. Like, you're not going to be stopping. Everything has to keep moving forward. You got to keep thinking about the next moment, preparing the orchestra for the next moment, being as patient and expressive as possible, knowing that this is a gift we're giving the audience that they are only going to experience in this moment, especially, an orchestra might have subs the next time, or the audience is going to be different. And so each performance is a really special opportunity to give that gift to that audience.
So a little later this year, you're leading the Westchester Symphonic Winds in a performance of the Overture to Candide by Leonard Bernstein. I love that piece. We played an arrangement of it in my college wind ensemble, and it's just awesome piece. This being a more modern piece, I use modern very lightly. How do you approach this differently as a conductor? Maybe how do you approach it more similarly?
This piece is really a unique blend of, let's say, classic like operetta overture music, a splash of Broadway, and then also some lush symphonic moments that are not really either. But regardless, it's a great overture that has kind of become almost more famous than the whole operetta in itself, especially as a standalone concert work for orchestras. But there are some very difficult things. I mean, first of all, being Bernstein and being, in the mid 1950s when he wrote this, there is an immense amount of syncopation and, I would say, even pseudo jazz rhythms to the music. Even when you have like the beginning after it comes in, and then you have the bass line like alternating on, ba 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 on beat 4, just kind of like being really off kilter. And then I think one of the most brilliant parts is thinking about the Glitter and Be Gay segment of the overture, where the melody is just this amazing, solemn, half note melody over the top that Cunegonde sings later in the operetta. But then underneath it, you have this like rapid 3/4 waltz alternating with the, the bass line, and then the sort of accompaniment and the tenor drum and the snare drum. And then to stitch all that together in a really meaningful way is really difficult. But I think for like interpretation is there's a much more bright brilliance to the sound, thinking about like, okay, well, if this was premiering at a Broadway pit or a pit orchestra of any sort, what kind of sound would the orchestra have? And trying to translate that as much as possible to the musicians, and that it's not going to sound like, Overture to Die Fledermaus, and it's not going to sound like even an earlier 20th century, Broadway overture. And I think too, like, Bernstein is he has his own very unique style, And, he has Candide and he has West Side Story, but he also tried to write, several other musicals after that didn't really become very prominent and famous. And I think that it's really unique to try to be as Bernstein as possible with this overture.
I'd love to know how you began your work in conducting and what sparked that initial love of the podium and baton.
I really have to credit going back to high school band. I mean, I had a great high school band director, and he gave me a lot of opportunities to get on the podium. When I was a junior, he'd be sick, and his sub plans would just be like, Andrew's running rehearsal. I got a chance to do that early on in high school. And then when I got to college, I was, as most 18-year-olds, confident and also undecided of what I wanted to do. And so I started off as a music education major. And after 6 months, I switched my major to trombone performance. And I thought, okay, well, I was getting some work as a trombonist, and I thought, yeah, I like playing trombone a lot. I should just play trombone. Another year later, I joined the San Francisco Youth Symphony. During that time was really an important amount of growth for me, because I thought that I had this idea like, okay, I'm training as a classical trombonist. I'm going to learn excerpts. I'm going to go take auditions. But the more I sat in the orchestra, I did enjoy it immensely. Every minute of it was fantastic. But as a trombonist in the orchestra, you tacit a lot. And there's a lot of waiting for moments. And sometimes you have rehearsals that you barely play. And all of that is very admirable for the people who are going after that. And I have the immense amount of respect for them, and they're brilliant at what they do. But for me, I was so much more fascinated with what else was going on when I wasn't playing. What is the conductor doing on stage? And for me, I just was fascinated with score study. I mean, I would go to the library and get scores of pieces we were doing and bring them to rehearsal, so that I wasn't counting rests, but really involved in the music. So as I'm doing that, I got to play in that orchestra for 3 years, and we got to work with amazing conductors like Charles Dutoit, Pablo Eres Casado, Michael Tilson Thomas. And I was just really inspired by what they were doing. And at the time, I actually was still not thinking about a career in conducting. I was still making my way as a young musician. And in 2014, there were 2 graduate students who I was good friends with, Nicole Boaz and Tom Langen, who were putting on this amazing period practice performance of it's actually a jazz suite for chamber orchestra called the Zodiac Suite by Mary Lou Williams. And Mary Lou Williams was this prominent African-American jazz pianist and composer in the early 1900s, and wrote this 12-movement suite called the Zodiac Suite based on the 12 zodiac signs. Wow. And each movement titled after the various, zodiac signs, Virgo, Taurus, Leo, etc., was representative of a musician friend who had that zodiac sign of hers. And really the whole piece is kind of like a mini piano concerto with chamber orchestra, and it's an amazing piece. But out of all amazing people, Gordon Haramaki, who was our medieval Renaissance Baroque music history faculty, he was obsessed with the idea of revitalizing this piece of music and doing a performance of it. And so he bought the $500 revised edition for Nicole and Tom to lead this graduate school project. And so Nicole was leading kind of musically through she was the pianist and leading the group through it and got everything together. But then she realized pretty quickly, she could not play the, very involved piano part and conduct at the same time. And so she asked me to conduct, and I just had an immense blast doing it. And I feel like that moment was really the sort of catalyst. Now, then from there, I got another opportunity to start a brass ensemble at Vanguard Music and Performing Arts, which is primarily a drum and bugle corps that
Right.
does the DCI summer tours. But they were trying to enhance different parts of their music education program. So they had a private lessons program and they had the brass ensemble. And so I started that with a colleague of mine, Charles Frost. And so from there, I got to conduct 3 seasons of amazing brass ensemble music. And we brought in soloists and we did collaborations with local high schools. And then from there, I got a job at Los Gatos High School in California, where I taught for 4 years. And that was really when every summer, I started going to conducting workshops and working with conductors all around the country to try to really hone my craft, because then I realized in undergrad, you get 1 or 2 semesters of conducting as a music major, or music
Hmm.
ed, or whatever your discipline is. And then you go into, especially if, like I was teaching 3 bands and 2 orchestras, and we were doing symphony orchestra literature. And I mean, I was spending, 5, 6 hours a day on the podium, but I only had about 1 or 2 semesters of real
Right.
training. And so I knew I needed to do more. And it really was kind of an organic way of getting into conducting, where I knew it was going to be important for my job as a high school teacher, but also I I really loved being involved with every aspect of the music making. And so conducting allowed me to really bridge all those different interests that I had as a musician. And then from there, I kind of took the plunge. I was sort of doing the career music director of a high school program in California. But really, for me, with my partner, who's an opera singer, moving to New York City was to try to, how could I cut my teeth as a more freelance conductor in the New York City metro region
Mm.
and be closer to Europe and meet some really great musicians, which I have. So that's sort of the short and long story of my journey.
No, it's fascinating. I mean, you touched on it briefly with the Los Gatos High School being the music director there, and you're working now as a band director at Byram Hills High School in New York. How do you bring your knowledge as a conductor to education and vice versa? How do you bring that into the classroom?
I really try as much as possible to treat, whether it's the high schoolers, and I also teach beginning instrumental instruction for fourth graders and fifth graders. And for me, I really try to treat them all as musicians. And really, the only difference between a fourth grader and a professional musician is they that the content is the same to a certain extent. It's just how much are you dealing with the product versus the process. I
Mm.
think about the process is much more important with younger musicians. So even as like how you structure rehearsal, how you first read a piece of music with them, how you structure your technique building with them, because depending on where you're teaching, students may or may not have private lessons. They may or may not be practicing outside of school on a regular basis and have that discipline and guidance. So sometimes, unfortunately, your role as a high school teacher is to build in lots of technique building for them, and so that's a very process oriented goal, where they may not be doing that outside of your realm, but you're going to help guide them. And then as you get closer to performances or things that you're working towards, you get closer to that product, which, usually if you're just working with like a professional orchestra or community orchestra, you're going to be much more focused on the product oriented building.
Right.
All right, here's our literature. We're going to sight read through it. All right, come to the next rehearsal, with a better preparation than, you had today. And that's all we can ask. But I think about treating them as musicians, focusing on the music as much as possible. I mean, there's a lot of things that we can focus on that can get in the way of students having a successful time. And it's always a little bit of a give and take. Like, you want to be excited and encouraging, but then you also have to set some great standards that you're trying to meet. And I believe I've heard some amazing high school groups around the country, from orchestras and bands, and I've been blessed to have some really amazing colleagues. And I mean, there are high school groups that can sound, just as good as regional orchestras or things like that. And so it's not that it's not possible, but showing them that, kind of like anything they're doing in school, they get great grades and they're trying to do well at the SAT. Well, there's nothing that says we can't do the same in music. And my philosophy sort of generally about that is that better we sound, or the higher level music we try to play and the more we work at it, the more fun it becomes. Because, no one who ever has picked up an instrument or spent a career in music has ever enjoyed when they've been in a rehearsal setting where the group sounds bad. And if you sound good, the more fun it becomes, then the better music you can play, the more opportunities you have, better musicians you get to play with. And, it's a snowball effect from there.
I love that process versus product. I wish somebody had talked to me about that earlier, but that's a great philosophy to have. And it's interesting because I feel like all the way through high school, all the ways in which like MPAs and state solo ensemble events and stuff like that, it is really weird that you're judged like holistically. Program success is judged almost exclusively on the product and not the process. But I think, like, you're so right. The process is so important for those. You don't even know how to practice, when you're young. You have to learn how to practice.
Yeah. And I think too, it is frustrating, like you said, and it can be kind of demoralizing as a student or as a teacher, that you don't get like the superior rating and you get like the excellent rating. And of course, ideally, as you prepare the students, you're hoping that they are going to get to a place where they're going to perform their best. But as you mentioned, the process is much more important, and that's where the magic happens. I mean, even in, I feel like, professional settings, and I think that the product is obviously important, and you want to have great concerts and you want to have great success, but it does, with your analogy earlier about, the role of a conductor, is that the process of how you go about score study and really diving into that is far more important than, really what even the concert looks like. Because if you don't do that at first,
Right.
everything is kind of at a loss.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask you two questions for people considering becoming conductors or pursuing conducting studies or just getting better at conducting. What has been the most challenging thing a young conductor might face going into a career in conducting, and what has been the most rewarding?
My advice, for what it's worth, I'm happy to share, is, I mean, the thing that I feel like is the biggest void in my journey right now is to find a really amazing mentor and find someone who can really guide you to that next level. Having that is really challenging, because I think that it takes an immense amount of capital to have sort of the means to live, and also be free to pursue these different opportunities, whether it's a workshop that you're flying and traveling to and paying for to be a part of, when you go to an audition as, let's say, an instrumentalist, or even a singer, or anyone who goes to an audition, I mean, you are going in there and you're putting your best foot forward with the sound you're making right there. But in terms of auditions for conducting positions, a lot of it is based on word of mouth and getting, recommended to
Yeah.
something versus actually getting a chance to audition, quote unquote, because you're sending in a CV and a resume, or maybe some letters of recommendation and some video footage. And depending on the committee, they, really may watch your video footage in depth, and that's great. But sometimes they don't, and it's hard to know when you do send and apply for these things, if things do or don't work out. It's hard to know like how much of the content you sent in they actually got to observe, and so I think that's the biggest challenge, is that, I mean, every conducting opportunity I've had since I've moved here, with the new conductors orchestra in February, Broadway Bach, and then upcoming Westchester Symphonic Winds too, it's literally all from meeting people and like putting myself out there and then asking for opportunities. And that's why I said the mentor thing is really critical. That's kind of my next task personally, is to, I'm done with grad school now, and
Right.
I'm out here, and I want to try to find someone who's going to, really help take me under their wing and get to that next level. And then the most rewarding is just all of the various different people I've met along the way. I mean, because really too, the other part of being a conductor is, if you go and stand on a podium with no musicians and you wave your arms, there's no sound. And you are really reliant on all of the people who make the sounds of the orchestra. And it's a very great honor and responsibility to be gifted that opportunity to lead them through concerts. But without their buy-in and without their commitment to you as a leader,
Right.
then you have no job, no career, no music making, no anything. And so I'll be eternally grateful for all of the past groups I've worked with, and future groups, because without that, it's impossible.
Yeah. We composers, conductors, we love and rely on performers. They are what makes the magic happen. Can't do it without them. Yeah. Thank you, Andrew, for taking the time to talk to me about all your upcoming projects and work. And Andrew, thanks again. It's been amazing.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I really appreciate it. And thanks so much for hosting today.
It was great hearing from Andrew about his conducting methodology and his upcoming performances. To learn more about his upcoming shows, please check out his website in the description. Thanks for listening to The Scorekeepers. The Scorekeepers is produced by Daniel Farrell Music and Sound, with graphic and visual design by Patrick Farrell. Scorekeepers is proudly hosted and recorded using Zencastr. Make sure you subscribe to hear new episodes of The Scorekeepers wherever you listen. And be sure to rate and review this episode to help us find new listeners. Thanks for listening.